Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Dr. Barbara Mollis, expert on the radical right and leading member of the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, or CARR. And I'll be giving a few opening notes today and also closing notes at the end of the event. So was the January 6th insurrection a terrorist attack? And if so, who's to blame responsible for it? This is one of the questions that we'll be addressing today, thanks to an amazing panel of experts that are here to join us today. As we enter 2022, CARR is kicking off with a series of public webinars. The one today is one of them. These webinars are meant to shine light on global events and trends that intersect with the radical right and pose a threat to democracy. The first of this is #AttackOnDemocracy events. Will be a virtual panel discussion, which we'll also record and you'll have access to in a couple of days, probably on YouTube. We'll be giving more information on our social media platforms. And for this discussion today, we have joining us CARR fellows Mark Potok, Kessa White, Jess White, and subject expert Cynthia Miller-Idris and Cass Mude, who will reflect on the Capitol Siege 1-year anniversary. Mark Potok, for 20 years, helped lead the Southern Poverty Law Center's work in monitoring the extreme right in the United States. Among other related topics, he has studied the role of conspiracy theories, fake news, and the press on the far right. He is now a senior fellow at CARR. Thanks for joining us today, Mark.
Thank you.
Kessa White is a program research associate at the Polarization Extremism Research Innovation Lab. Her work focuses on white supremacy, extremism in online spaces, and the radicalization with a focus on homeland security. Kessa writes for CARR and the Accelerationism Research Consortium. Welcome, Kessa. I'm actually not sure Kessa is here.
I'm right here.
Okay.
Can you see me?
Yes, yes. Welcome. Dr. Jess White is a research fellow in the Terrorism and Conflict Group at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Her expertise includes countering terrorism and violent extremism policy and programming, as well as gender mainstream strategies. Jessica leads the far-right extremism and terrorism research program at RUSSI and is a co-founder of the Extremism and Gaming Research Network. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idris is professor in the School of Public Affairs and in the School of Education at the American University in Washington, D.C., where she directs the Polarization Extremism Research and Innovation Lab in the Center for University Excellence. Dr. Miller-Idris regularly testifies before the US Congress, the United Nations, and other institutions on trends in domestic violent extremism and strategies for prevention and disengagement. Thanks for joining us, Cynthia. And Professor
Sorry, struggling, just saying happy to be here. Delayed unmuting.
Thanks for coming. Cass Mude, finally, is a Stanley Wade Shelton UGAF professor in international affairs and a distinguished research professor at the University of Georgia, as well as professor at the CREX, or Center for Research on Extremism, at the University of Oslo. His research agenda centers around the question of how can liberal democracies defend themselves against political challengers without undermining their own core values. A key question to keep in mind today. Thanks for joining us, Cass.
Thank you for having me.
So our panelists will be discussing the Capitol siege under the expert moderation of Dr. Uday Chandra. Professor Chandra, who is assistant professor at Georgetown University in Qatar, is not joining us today just as moderator, but also as representative of Culturico, CARR's much valued media partner, who we thank for its support. And right before we begin, I would also like to thank Gail, who for more than 65 years has collaborated with academic institutions, schools, and public libraries around the world to empower the discovery of knowledge. For today's event, Gail's support has been crucial. And speaking of support, and I promise I'm almost done, please consider supporting CARR today so that we can continue to offer events like this. As the world's leading research and educational group focused on radical right extremism, the work of CARR has already led to significant changes in the way social media giants moderate hate content and the way governmental bodies understand and prepare for terrorist threats emerging from the radical right. And this despite the fact CARR is actually a very young organization and it is run on an entirely voluntary basis. But we keep on going and growing with bright ambitions and passions. With your support, we can achieve those ambitions together. Thank you, and I will give the floor to our moderator, Dr. Uday Chandra. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Barbara. This is fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what all of you have to say. Let's start right away with Cass. Let's go in the reverse order of how you read out their names, and I'll hand over to Cass.
Yes, thank you very much, Uday. I consider myself not so much as one of the experts and therefore panelists on this topic, but what I rather would like to do is present the broader framework by just looking at who was involved in the January 6th insurrection, and to a certain extent how they relate, and perhaps say a little bit about how they developed. So very simply stated, you would say that there were two actors here. You had the far right and you had the state, but both of them were heterogeneous, but with a lot of overlap. And so with regard to the far right, there were at least 4 different actors involved in one way or another. The most passive was the larger rally, which was the rally that started outside and from which all of the protesters, or almost all of the protesters, came. That rally in itself, like without that rally, there probably would never have been an insurrection. And at the same time, that rally as a whole was not part of the insurrection. Obviously, it had the most diverse and the most heterogeneous group of people involved. Then you had the rioters, the ones that actually went for the Capitol, and of them, a part that went into it, which to a certain extent is also a diverse group, because I think there were at least 2 important groups. One was a small subgroup that had planned to do this, and that would, at the moment, we're talking about people like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. And then you have a much larger group that probably spontaneously followed. And so the argument would be that without the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and people who plan to go, let alone without the weak support, the weak defense by the Capitol Police, these people would never have stormed the Capitol. Now, both groups got quite a lot of attention. I think a third group gets far too little attention, and that were the members of Congress inside, who were trying to do pretty much what the insurrection also tried, namely to overturn the election results. These were, of course, just a small group, well, relatively sizable minority of Republican members of Congress, who some of them had ties to the rally, others not. And then finally, the Trump White House, or Trump and his inner core. Now, obviously, all of them are related, and at the top of the pyramid is Trump. Without Trump, there wouldn't have been a rally. Without Trump, these members of Congress wouldn't have tried to overturn the election. And possibly without Trump, the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers wouldn't have tried the insurrection. Now, on the other hand, we have the state. And in a sense, the state is attacked. But of course, part of the state is also the White House. And the White House played a major role in instigating this, but also played a major role in weakening the defense. And as a consequence, I think January 6th has shown the US state possibly at its weakest. And so for me, those things are important from various perspectives. I think one of the important things is, if we think about how to prevent that, we should make a right analysis about the strength of the far right, as well as the strength/weakness of the state. And we shouldn't overshoot. And so I think that in many of the analysis, the strength of the far right is overstated, of the insurrectionist far right, and particularly, let's say, the rioters. And I think in particularly the weakness of the state at that point in time is forgotten. Like under any normal circumstances, there would have been a massive presence of National Guard and anything else, and these people would never have made it anywhere near the capital. Now, that doesn't mean it can't happen again, because the Republicans can come back to the White House. But as long as Democrats are in it, I think there's a very small chance to it. Finally, as a point, I think it's important to look at the four groups both together and separately. We have at the moment the state in particularly looking a lot at the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. To me, these are the least important of all. These are the least threatening. We see the state and the media looking much less at the members of Congress who are trying to overturn the electoral result. And we see, I think, still a misunderstanding of what the connection is between, let's say, the rally and the people who made it. And so to me, one of the unanswered questions is, like, what makes that real estate agent fly from Dallas to DC and then get up involved in a mob that they normally wouldn't want to be seen with? Like, how does that work, and what is the consequence of that? And of course, everything has become far more important and to a certain extent far more dangerous since the last weeks and months, or even since this weekend, when Trump has by and large dangled the prospect of amnesty to the people involved in this type of illegal action, right? And so I think I look forward to listening to the real experts and learning more about what the different parts of this day, how they look, how they interacted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cass. Let's move to Cynthia.
Terrific. Thank you. So I want to just start by, first of all, thanks, Cass. Fascinating, as always, to listen to you. And I feel like I have so many questions for you already. So I'm going to try to keep my comments very brief so we can hopefully get to some Q&A. I know we have a very short window in this whole hour here. But I want to start with a question that Barbara raised right at the beginning about, was this domestic terrorism? And I think there's really, I've made this argument before in writing, that there's really no way that it's not domestic terrorism according to the US's own definitions of domestic terrorism, which is that it would involve acts dangerous to human life that are in violation of the criminal laws of the US or of any state, that were intended to either intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or, and here's the key phrase, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. So there's some other stuff there as well. But I think, I'm happy to have a discussion about that. I think we get so caught up in definitions sometimes that, and of course, there's disagreement on this point about whether it was domestic terrorism, but by the own definition, by our own legal code, it was very clearly, it meets that criteria. What's different, though, it almost doesn't matter in a way, because my argument would be that whether or not it meets the definition of domestic terrorism doesn't much change what happens on the accountability side, because of the way that our own absence of domestic terrorism charges works. But also, nothing in our traditional counterterrorism approaches would have prevented this type of domestic terrorism incident, because it looked really different than all the other domestic terrorism incidents we'd had prior to that. And so there was, of course, some intelligence failures. We've heard about that, but traditional counterterrorism strategies, which are designed to affect, study, infiltrate bounded groups that are being watched and monitored and surveilled and infiltrated, those kinds of groups only represented about 16–17% of those who've been arrested to date. The vast majority of other actors, based on arrests anyway, had no prior affiliation with groups and wouldn't have been caught in the same kind of intelligence sweep that you would typically would. Instead, this was a largely spontaneously mobilized group of people. Again, there were clear domestic violent extremist actors who were formal parts of groups, and we're seeing those arrests come out too. But the vast majority of people, even in the kinds of weapons that they wielded, like fire extinguishers and flagpoles, were relatively spontaneously mobilized into criminal behavior based on massive amounts of disinformation and propaganda that they had come to believe over a relatively short period of time. Although they had been primed for months, I would say. The intensive period of time of just a few months of radicalization is also really different than what we normally see in terms of people's willingness to be violent. So the main thing I want to argue out of this is what I often argue, so many of you have heard me say this quite a lot, is that, that we need to be thinking not only about short-term fixes and accountability and how to beef up our domestic terrorism divisions in the Department of Justice and other forms of securitized, militarized law enforcement approaches, but we also need sweeping changes in how we approach prevention, which in this country, mostly comes down to a measure of success that is about how good we've trained people to barricade the doors, right? And that's a very cynical way of looking at prevention, but it is mostly about prevention of violence that is training bystanders to intervene effectively in incredibly important ways, as we just saw in Texas. I don't think you can argue that we don't need that kind of training for people to deal with a crisis once it's unfolding. But I also don't think we should kid ourselves that that is in any way a kind of solution to actually prevent people from going into the pipeline to begin with. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about a public health type of approach to prevention that is community-based, that is about prevention of the persuasiveness of propaganda and disinformation, that is about reducing the fertile ground in which extremist ideologies can thrive by building more inclusive and less racist environments, I would say. It's why countries like Germany tackle right-wing extremism and racism in one and the same set of initiatives with €1 billion. And I could go on and on about that. But I think that it's important to understand that that what happened did meet the definition and the criteria, but is also different from what we've seen before, and in ways that can raise some red flags for us about what needs to be done now. The last thing I want to say is that we also saw quite a bit of convergence and blurriness on that day, meaning that in ways that I think are really typical of event-driven mobilization and some of the spontaneous kind of violence that we saw, where you had a wide range of people who were white supremacists, conspiracy theorists, unlawful militias, QAnon supporters, right? You had all kinds of groups there, Proud Boys, plus the the vast majority of just sort of ordinary super fans and Trump voters. But they share across them, and there's a really interesting report that came out last week from the British-based group, the Institute for the Study of Radicalization. I'm missing the exact name, and I'll get it and drop it in the chat, but it's about convergence across ideologies. And I just want to say that we're seeing increasing convergence, not just in the people's willingness to come together around the lowest common denominator, like we saw on January 6th, but also kind of crossover, just very key blurriness and support across the extremist spectrum, particularly across the far right and the Salafi jihadist spectrum, on issues of supremacism. So white supremacism, male supremacism, Western supremacism on the Western side, heteronormativity, all kinds of issues related to supremacism and anti-government extremism and anti-Semitism. That those kinds of things, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny, male supremacism, and anti-government sentiment tend to cut across all of these groups. And I think increasingly, rather than just looking at the organizational forms of these groups and then trying to tackle those organizational forms with traditional surveillance infiltration methods, it would make a lot of sense to invest in trying to interrupt some of those pre-ideological form types of beliefs and work on the prevention at earlier stages. So I'll stop there, but those are my thoughts about January 6th. There's a lot more to be said. And thanks, Jessica, appreciate that. And just a shout out to a lot of other experts in this room. I've seen your names who I know could weigh in with even better thoughts than I just left you with. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. In terms of thinking, making us think about the lax precautions that were taken as these extremists and militias, converged and wreaked havoc. I'd like to ask Kessa next, actually, whether we could technically define the January 6th insurrection as a terrorist attack.
Yeah, thank you for your question. While we must understand that there were a lot of things that did happen on January 6th, it's really difficult to define the entire action as terrorism. So I would consider it protesting, rioting, and then also just breaking a lot of federal laws, because if you think about it, no one has actually been charged with terrorism on that day. And that we need to take more action when it comes to being proactive instead of reacting. So when it comes to defining it as terrorism, we have to understand that some of the actors that were there came for violent reasons, and some of those people just came because they wanted to say that they were in the Capitol when all of this was happening. So depending on who was there, you can determine how and what their purpose was on that day. And then kind of echoing what Cynthia Miller-Idris said, it is a little bit difficult to categorize that as domestic terrorism because we don't have a federal law or a statute when it comes to that topic.
Right. And Mark, to what extent do you see Trump here as criminally liable? Sorry, we need to unmute. Yeah.
Let me take a little longer. I've got some notes here to go through because there's a series of interesting questions. I mean, first of all, just to say what probably most people already know, if he were still sitting as president, the Constitution says nothing about that. The Supreme Court has never ruled, but since 1973, the Department of Justice has had a policy which says you cannot indict a sitting president. It's maybe worth pointing out that Ken Starr, who infamously investigated Bill Clinton over Monica Lewinsky, the intern, and all of that, Starr felt himself not bound by that rule. In any case, it doesn't matter because Trump was not reelected. He's no longer a sitting president. So just to point out, what was it that Trump did on that day that could have been indictable in some way as a criminal matter? Well, at the National Mall, he said a series of very provocative things. We will stop the steal. We will never give up. We will never concede. If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have any country anymore. We are going to the Capitol. Of course, he didn't in the end go to the Capitol. And the results of this, arguably, or in any case, what happened in the end was one woman shot to death by Capitol Police. One officer pepper sprayed so badly that he died the next day after suffering 2 strokes. 3 other individuals died of, in 2 cases, heart disease during the melee, and 1 of a methamphetamine overdose. And worth mentioning also that in the aftermath, arguably as a result of this, 4 different officers, members of the Capitol Police, committed suicide. So 138 officers were injured, 15 of them badly enough that they were hospitalized. That was the upshot of all this. So it seems to me the first question is, could Trump be indicted for criminal incitement? Just to explain briefly what American law is on criminal incitement, it's really a very narrow and difficult case to make. Criminal incitement requires that the inciter intended to cause violence, and what that person did or said, in fact, was likely to cause violence. And the second criteria is that that violence be very imminent. So it's not enough for me to say, we should attack the police and, kill police or whatever, blow up the federal building tomorrow. That's too far off. It has to be imminent, like right then. These criteria seem to have been met by what Trump said, or arguably could be seen that way. But I think as a practical matter, that is incredibly unlikely. It's very, very rare for incitement charges to be brought. They're very hard to convict on. And I just think that everyone who's looked at this agrees that that's not likely to happen. However, let me say parenthetically that a professor named Garrett Epps of the University of Baltimore, examining that very question, criminal incitement, concluded that in his view, it was an agonizingly close call, right? So that's one possibility, incitement. Just as predicate to what Trump did in terms of inaction, that day. He waited 187 minutes before he finally reluctantly put out a video asking his his supporters to calm down, essentially to be nonviolent. But even in this message, he told his supporters he loved them. During that same period, his daughter Ivanka tried twice to convince him to call off the dogs. He would not do it. House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy also approached him and talked to him. Trump told him essentially not to worry about it, that this was really Antifa who was behind the attack. And then finally, I would say that Liz Cheney, who of course is the co-chairwoman or chairperson of the House Committee investigating January 6th, very recently described Trump's role in all of this as, quote, a supreme dereliction of duty. So my question is, the question becomes, could he face other charges other than criminal incitement for what he did or did not do on that day? Possibilities being perhaps seditious conspiracy, aiding and abetting a conspiracy, obstructing an official proceeding, an act of Congress, and so on. I think it's fair to say that there's no real evidence that Trump yet directly conspired with, say, the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers in organizing the violence, right? I mean, nothing like that has come out. But the key point, it seems to me here, is that Trump does not have to have conspired with anyone in order to be convicted, to be at least potentially liable for aiding and abetting either a seditious conspiracy or some other type of conspiracy, or aiding and abetting an official proceeding of Congress. So the idea would be, say somehow he learned that there was violence planned. Perhaps one of the Oath Keepers who were guarding Roger Stone at one point told Stone a little something about their plans. Perhaps Roger Stone said something to Trump directly, or in some way Trump learned that there was violence contemplated or planned in advance. If in that case, he then realizing he had in front of him at the National Mall a hot crowd, raring to go, and said various incendiary things designed to get that crowd to join in the planned violence, which he knew something about in advance, that is certainly at least potentially indictable. So that's, it doesn't matter, it's probably worth adding, that if he disingenuously said during his speech at the National Mall, something he did say, that he wanted people to, quote, peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Well, he can say that, but, it's like, John Gotti saying, of course, we don't want to break any laws here, right? I mean, it potentially is completely disingenuous. And if in fact he's making these incendiary statements with a knowledge that they're very likely to be acted on, then yes, he could be criminally liable. So I want to conclude by saying, nevertheless, I think as a practical matter, the likelihood of prosecutors bringing charges on any of those grounds against Trump seems, at least at the moment, very distant indeed, absent, some further findings of, Trump being directly involved in a conspiracy. So I guess I want to wrap up by saying it seems to me that Trump is far more likely, he's in far more danger in terms of criminal liability, with a number of other things that are happening related to the election, and not so much his action or inaction on the actual day of January 6th. Probably the single most dangerous thing for Trump right now is the Georgia grand jury that is looking at his call to Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, in which he urged him to, quote unquote, find 11,780 votes, and also importantly, kind of threatened Raffensperger in the sense that he said that, there could be criminal consequences. He would be taking a big risk, quote unquote, if he didn't do something about looking into the the lies about there having been a lot of voter fraud in Georgia and so on. Also, other potential sources of liability, quite apart from January 6th, are the Republican plot to forge and get accepted fake certifications of electors in 7 different states. We don't know that Trump was directly involved in that, but we do know that some people on the investigating committee in the House have alleged that the White House at least briefed some Republican staffers, and that gives us a feel or a sense that Trump may well and probably was behind that. That is potentially a felony. Another thing, another source of danger for Trump is the plan, which apparently originated with Michael Flynn, his former national security advisor, to use possibly military law and position of martial law in order to seize voting machines, pretty clearly another potential felony. Or perhaps Trump's involvement in directing, if indeed he did direct, the lawyers and other operatives who were meeting at the Willard Hotel in days leading up to the January 6th insurrection to essentially plot a way for Trump to come out having won the election. So I think, you know, those other possibilities other than his action and inaction on January 6th are things that are being looked at very closely by Benny Thompson's House committee, the select committee investigating the events of January 6th. And that is probably where we should keep our eyes focused on if we are hoping for or expecting or even contemplating the possibility of Trump actually facing some kind of criminal liability.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we'll come back to you. Jessica, could you say a little bit about how we might kind of prevent a repeat of what happened on January 6th?
Yeah, sure. The fun part about coming last on such a great panel of experts is that you always are good to repeat something that's already been said. But I'll try and pick up from what Cynthia was saying, I think, and expand a little bit, because I think if we're talking about trying to prevent something similar from happening again, you have to talk about sort of public radicalization that has occurred, and it's a massive problem. It's not a small group of people, like she was saying. Yes, you have the organizations and the groups that are very organized that need to be addressed, but this was a mass problem, a public problem, and I think that it doesn't fit the model of prevention that exists in preventing and countering violent extremism. Programming has, you know, it's developed. We've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't, but it's been developed in the context of the global war on terror with a very specific target group, often targeted at, you know, minority Muslim populations within majority countries, Western countries, or, you know, and that type of targeting isn't going to work with this concern about massive public buy-in to disinformation and to conspiracy and the things that led, you know, a mob of people to take up action. And I think, you know, in thinking about how to address that, we have to step back now and think about carving out a space again for public civic discourse. Things have become so polarized around Republican versus Democrats in the US context. And even, I mean, I'm American, I live in London. You can see it happening here. You can see it carrying over here in a very strange way. It's polarization about US politics that is impacting globally conversations about other political, you know, situations. And I think that space has to be found again, where there can be a public discussion about politics without othering. And I think that is the sense of sort of the othering, that is the sense of radicalization that occurs at the extreme, you know, end of the spectrum when one ideology and others, you know, some group, but that is happening in a way that is affecting populations that we wouldn't have normally expected to see. Soccer moms were, you know, buying into QAnon conspiracy theory, and sort of it's reaching people that it didn't reach before. And I think that has some to do with the sort of temperature of intolerance that is rampant in the US right now. And, you know, we see it in Europe and other parts of the world too. I think some of this, we can talk about media in a way that it does have an impact. And I think that, you know, sort of preventing this from happening again, we'll have to engage in a conversation about mainstream media and the discourse that occurs there. You know, social media obviously offers endless opportunities for unedited news, unverified facts, you know, disinformation to abound. But the mainstream media, there's a journalistic responsibility to report things factually and fairly, and that has sort of, I think, become lost in the US mainstream media environments. And I think that tends to feed, I would suggest that tends to feed sort of this disinformation that is, you know, spreading to the public, the sort of the raising of the temperature of political discourse. So I think that, addressing mainstream media coverage would need to be a part of the solution from preventing this happening again. I think, just addressing the disinformation online will be part of the solution. There's been a lot learned about PCVE programming, directed online. I think there are lessons to be taken from what's been learned about finding target groups and who do you direct it at, who are the people that really need to be reached, about creating communities where people can disengage. That's almost, I think that's almost as important as preventing in some ways, is giving people a way to get out. They get into these conversations and these groups, who buy into the conspiracy theory, into these massive amounts of disinformation. They don't know how to get out of it. So some of it will be about providing a space to disengage. And then I think, there's this question about addressing deep social inequalities, about misogyny and racism, and these things are impacting their grievances. There are grievances that people hold, and they use those to raise the level of of the conversation, to turn up the othering that's happening in these conversations. And I think that until we can address everyday misogyny and until we can address racism and policing, that those things are going to feed these problems going forward. I'm a military veteran myself, and sort of been thinking about, writing about lately, a lot of questions were raised after what happened in January 6th about the very visible participation of former and some active military members, and what to do about that. And I think that reflects the wider conversation about what to do about this sort of, the wider public problem that's happening. It's just reflected in the military as well. But there is, these existing inequalities in society feed these problems, and until we can address those, I think that, the threat will continue. That's maybe not a very coherent response, but we can come back to anything that I said.
Sure. We have two questions, and both of them reference QAnon, and anyone can really jump in. This is really about why there was no response to what was classified as a domestic terror threat. And the other was about, kind of at the level of narratives which, challenge liberal democracy. And, kind of how do you deal with those more broadly?
Well, I can try to jump in. There was a little bit of, there was some reaction. We have, of course, Twitter, obviously deplatformed. There was some deplatforming that happened right after January 6th, including, major elected officials and major distributors of propaganda and disinformation. That really did significantly reduce the spread of circulation of disinformation about the election. We also saw things like Twitter introducing these sort of new tools to help you recognize something that might be disinformation. Whether those are effective or not, I think is anybody's guess. But my general argument about this is that all of those, anything related to deplatforming or content moderation, while important, is always going to be a band-aid solution, just like the law enforcement and security approaches are a band-aid solution to the broader sets of problems that by the time you're deplatforming or creating content moderation, removal of bad information or propaganda or extremist content, it's already out there. It's already, millions of people have been exposed to it potentially. Even when you take down things like the live streaming of videos, like the Christchurch attack, they circulate, they continue to circulate, they pop back up again. it's a constant whack-a-mole kind of problem. So I'm not saying that shouldn't be done. I just don't think that's in any way a solution. It's really a band-aid, really the wound is already there and it's preventing things from getting worse potentially, but it doesn't really address the core issues, which are much earlier in the process. So, again, this is an argument I make all the time to very little, there's been very little take up of it. I will say there are discussions. I shouldn't say very little take up. There are discussions happening. It's very, very slow. After 9/11, we stood up an entire new agency in this country devoted to security within 14 months. Like, we can mobilize real resources when we perceive a national security risk. We're just not doing it as quickly in this case. And part of that is the extreme partisanship about what it is. Part of it is the accountability and the investigations. I think important as they are, sidelining discussions about prevention. But I'm testifying before Congress again on Wednesday. Kisa's seen that testimony because it got submitted last night. And I will make these same points again. I will continue to push the prevention argument, the public health intervention, the need for early intervention, civic education, engagement, preventing susceptibility to conspiracy theories, disinformation, inoculation kinds of work. And I do think that there is more interest in it being multi-sectoral, multi-agency, getting it out of the security space. But nobody in the States, I would say, really knows how to do that, because we've had a whole generation of people who just think about this through a terrorism and security lens. So that's my cynical take, and I can give you the optimism later, but I want to give others a chance.
I mean, if I could just add a little something.
Sure.
I have an even more, sort of unhappy outlook. I mean, it just seems to me that most of this CVE work has not done really much of anything. A lot of it's been bordering on anti-democratic in certain ways. And in any event, if we can't convince 100 billion Americans or so, that vaccines will help them avoid getting deadly COVID and dying in the hospital, my God, how are we going to convince them that, there's not a plot to replace white people in the United States or all over the Western world? So, I mean, the QAnon question is, it's a little dumbfounding, right? I mean, it's a completely, it's an LSD trip, on steroids, right? I mean, it's a completely fantastical set of ideas that don't, accord with any kind of reality. It's not even like, the Kennedy assassination. Well, there's this piece of evidence, and that piece of evidence, maybe it was a larger plot. There's nothing there, and yet people go and shoot up Cosmic Pizza in Washington and all kinds of other things. So in any case, I'm just saying that I despair when certainly, yes, if we could fix social inequalities, if we could fix racism and anti-Semitism, if we could get people to stop believing in conspiracy theories. But my God, those things have been with us for a very long time. They're obviously growing at an incredibly rapid pace. And it seems to me, the thing that's often not said in the discussion of preventing or countering violent extremism, or, whatever the phrase is that, it's not Facebook algorithms that are causing the rise of the radical right and this violence. It's not, yes, social media is important. Yes, there's this factor and that factor and the other factor, and certainly what the media has become. But at the end of the day, we're living through a historical period in which there are massive socioeconomic changes occurring in our society and other particularly Western societies. And there is a huge backlash. And that backlash is kind of supported by conspiracy theories and allegations, which are ridiculous, like the QAnon allegations. But, so the explanations are not real. But what I'm suggesting is that the causes of the rise of the radical right are real, right? It's not just because, Richard Spencer needs to see a psychiatrist and stop beating his wife. Anyway.
Okay. Do we have
It
any
can
other?
happen.
Yeah,
It can
sure.
happen really fast. So when it comes to the QAnon conspiracies on social media, for example, it's very hard to counter a lot of those narratives because you have people that are faking professional credentials by calling themselves doctors and saying you don't need to get this vaccine because of XYZ, which causes those individuals to say, hey, this doctor told me that I don't need to get it, so I'm not going to get it because they're a doctor, while they're just regular Joe Schmo on the street. So when it also comes to deplatforming a lot of these individuals, while it is helpful in the short run, they also go further underground, which is harder for researchers and law enforcement to then understand what they're doing, the conversations and everything. And also something that I've been seeing a lot recently is them going further back onto other platforms that they have once veered away from, such as Stormfront. They've been posting a lot on Stormfront recently because they know that we're looking at Twitter, we're looking at Telegram, we're looking at Gab and all those other platforms. So they're going back in time because they think that we forgot about those platforms. They're trying to build them back up again and create communities, and then also create those communities that they once had on Telegram by finding their little echo chambers and creating little buddies with those people. So they also have that one line into the community if they ever get lost.
Right.
Can I jump
Sure,
in on this too?
Sure, yes. Please come in. Yeah.
I think something that is really notable here in the UK is the age of people that are being arrested, their children that are being arrested for participating in these chat rooms and planning violent acts, and they're very young. And I think that's something to take note of. I mean, and something we've learned about preventing and countering violent extremism, which Mark is right, it's not had a great record of success, but something that has been learned, I think, out of what has been done and lessons that can be taken away is the importance of education and the importance of sort of teaching critical analysis and these skills that it's not about teaching what's right and wrong necessarily, but about teaching people, young and old, all ages, the skills to question something and question its source and its validity and sort of the thinking behind it. And I think something that is connected obviously to wider global events, but something that's been amplified in the last couple of years because of COVID is the amount of time people spend online. And the way that people have coped is by getting into online gaming or joining these chats or finding communities in the online space because that was all that was available to them, which has, in I think a lot of cases, exposed people to more extreme content than they would maybe necessarily have been exposed to before, or encourage them into spaces that have perhaps contributed to their radicalization in some way. So I think there is something, and I'm certainly, I think a lot of online PCPE has not been effective, but there are lessons that you can take away, I think, and help to think about what to do going forward and trying to build up people's resilience to what they might come into contact with online, especially, well, of all ages, but especially with the youth. It's really sad to see how young these kids are that are being arrested for these violations now.
Right. Cass, would you like to jump in on this?
This is not really something I have much expertise in. I don't really look at online or what platforms do. I'm just wondering, I always worry how hard the state responds. And so I was a teenager too, one day. I was a very, very long time. And what do teenagers do, right? They try to set off older people. And so in today's terms, that is owning the libs. You pushed boundaries. In the Netherlands, we pushed boundaries around the Second World War when we were young. Of course, we did that for only 2 free people to see because we couldn't do it online, anonymously online. And so I think that one of the things is what we know about youth is that it's very transient. People go through different types of stages, different kind of subcultures, different kind of things, often relatively meaningless. Doesn't mean that they can't do damage, don't get me wrong, but it's not an overly deep commitment. But what we also know from the 80s, 90s, for example, is that if kids get stigmatized or registered for far-right offenses, that the cost-benefit analysis of their activities changes. And so you have kids of 15, 16 who get arrested at a far-right rally, right, and are now noted as having been arrested, and B, as an active far-right person, which means that they become kind of semi-heroes within their subculture, and they become more stigmatized outside of it, which to a certain extent is an incentive to stay within that subculture. And so, overall, I'm extremely skeptical about CVE. I think I share with Mark a big worry about anti-democratic elements in a lot of it. But I think what is also really important, and maybe that's just me, maybe I'm just old and I don't understand this, but I think online activism is just so fundamentally different from offline activism, and particularly in the far right, because it can be done from afar, it can be done often anonymously, that I'm not sure that we should really treat it with the knowledge that we have from offline activism. And so, again, maybe academia has moved far beyond that. Again, this is not what I study. I just worry whenever the state gets involved, I worry.
You know, perhaps one thing to add to all of this is that, I mean, I think it's been kind of implied by all of us, but, you know, at the end of the day, it's probably incredibly difficult brick by brick rebuilding of our communities and building bridges between our communities. And as a country like the United States becomes more and more, you know, a country of many different minorities and no majority, right? It's around the corner. That seems more important than ever. And I will throw out, probably to the ridicule of my colleagues, so just a kind of wacky idea I've had. I mean, it could never happen, but if I were sort of king of the universe, you know, I would think about instituting in the United States a national service program, like many other countries have, where kids at a certain age, say between high school and college, do some kind of national service that hopefully would help to promote not only critical thinking, which I totally agree is like the key in many ways to all of this, but a sense of what it's like for other people in the world. So my little fantasy was that, you know, I'd make every kid in the United States, you know, journalism's in trouble in the United States, local journalism is suffering. So sign up all those kids, and or, you know, 50 million of them or so, whatever, you know, a lot of people, and make them go out and work for the country, right? Make them go out and work in some little community, you know, like I did, starting a tiny little newspaper in Hammond, Indiana. Because I say all that just because, you know, I learned stuff about the world that I never, ever would have known. You know, I grew up in a very particular kind of environment. You know, I came from the class I did, the kind of background I did. And that puts you into a place where you see in very up close and personal terms what other people's lives and worlds and communities are like. Anyway, like I say, just a fantasy idea, but it always seemed to me like an important at least idea. And you know, the other thing briefly about the about the non-experts out there, let's remember there are also plenty of people like Dr. Ron Paul, right, member of Congress, who are happy, despite being a physician, to spread lies about the coronavirus and vaccines. So, you know, there has to be some work taking on individually the liars and the propagandists.
We have a couple of interesting questions. One about non-white and minority participation and support of what happened on January 6th. And more broadly, you know, the question about a cultural movement influencing what happened in Congress that day, and then subsequently Ron Paul and other people. You know, that you have a whole narrative that's now made its way into the lawmaking chambers.
Maybe I can quickly chime in on the issue of non-white engagement at least across the far right fringe and spectrum, which, you know, if you understand the primary set of beliefs, on the one hand, anti-government beliefs, on the other hand, as supremacist, it's not that contradictory, because there are many forms of supremacism, right? We have white supremacy most commonly in the US historically, but also male supremacy, Western supremacy, Christian supremacy, all these other forms of supremacy that set up hierarchies of superiority and inferiority that ultimately dehumanize the other and position them as an existential threat that has to be thwarted with violent action. And so when you look at something like the Proud Boys, who describe themselves as Western chauvinists, which is a Western supremacist way of thinking, that's a civilizational kind of framework that positions an existential other of immigrants or Islam as a threat against a Western civilization. And so there's nothing in that would say you could defend that and still be a member of a minority ethnic group who identifies with a Western supremacist standpoint. Same thing with male supremacy, which is also a part of that, right? There are no women allowed. So I think when you understand the framework of supremacy as essential, and then that it is articulated in different ways through these exclusionary hierarchies of belonging and of superiority and inferiority, that's at the root of it. And again, the history in this country has been one in which white supremacy has really been dominant, but it's not the only form that's been dominant. And then the second thing I just want to pick up on really quickly, because both Cass and Mark mentioned it, is that the kind of prevention that I'm talking about is not the CVE, the old CVE or PVE framework, which I also don't like and didn't like, because those are frameworks that center the fringes still, that are targeting, that are facing toward the fringes and trying to prevent them. The kind of prevention that I talk about when I'm talking about a public health framework is the German kind of defensive democracy approach, which is about investing in the mainstream to make them more resilient as communities, to not accept the ongoing efforts of the fringe to recruit them and radicalize them or spread propaganda. So the idea is that you equip the middle with critical thinking skills, with media literacy, source integrity skills, the ability to recognize this propaganda and reject it, but also the mindsets that make them less willing to give fertile ground or create fertile ground. So less racist, less exclusionary, less likely to believe in these kinds of supremacist hierarchies. That is a different kind of set of needs that is about, and I think this idea of a national service program would be one way to do that, to cultivate empathy, to cultivate the kinds of mindsets that are needed. It's, you have to do that within a framework that allows freedom of speech and the protection of people's beliefs. But you can also, as we often say in the lab here, like, people have the right not to wear deodorant, but they make choices every day about living in a community that are about the good of the community. And so it's a difference between what you're allowed to do and maybe what we all should do to be a part of a community.
We also wear deodorant.
So maybe I can bridge that to the other question, because it goes to the broader movement in which this happens, right? And so I'm very sympathetic to that aspect of the German approach. I must say I'm very skeptical about other elements of the militant democracy model, but particularly the prevention through education, like I really like. At the same time, I live in Georgia, right? And I live in one of those states where this type of education is being outlawed, and I think that really doesn't sink in enough. I think in a lot of people who don't live in red states is, I mean, I've been doing this for 25 years or something, but I've never ever thought that I would live in a country where the governing power at the state level, at least at my state level, and one of the two powers at the national level, right, just doesn't agree on this analysis of the threat. And so, like, I spoke to some staffers of various committees, and most of the things like that I say go nowhere, because I don't focus on Oath Keepers or Proud Boys. I focus on the radicalization of the mainstream, and that mainstream controls the agenda. Like it controls the agenda in states like Florida and Georgia and etc. by pushing a type of education that doesn't allow for these kind of questions, or it is powerful enough to keep these pieces off the agenda at Congress, where you can't even use the term far right, or you can't speak about radicalization of Republican Party without it directly becoming like a partisan issue. And so to me, that is the most worrying thing about the situation in the US, how small the leeway is that we have. And that's the reason I think why Biden has pivoted towards this so-called violent domestic extremism. Because if you focus on relatively small marginalized groups, then at least part of the Republican Party will be happy to go with it, because it serves their agenda, right? It keeps the association of far-right racism, white supremacy, danger linked to people who wear Camp Auschwitz t-shirts and who look like the shaman, and far away from what we're experiencing at a daily basis, which is the Republican Party, which is Turning Point USA, which are all kind of organizations like that, by and large, are normalized. And so again, I think a lot of these are great initiatives, but I wonder what the legal possibilities today in the US are, where education is a state right, and many states are now controlled by Republican parties who are like just absolutely adamantly fighting that with amazing laws.
So just to quickly follow up, Cass, so are you kind of in comparative perspective with, say, many Western Europe or Central European countries, are you saying that the task is just simply harder in the US federal setup?
Well, obviously not, it's not worse in the US than in Hungary, right? Or in Poland, where
right.
There is, but compared to, I would say, every West European country, even Britain, which is in a certain sense also has moved far. But you think about Sweden or the Netherlands, which all have pretty strong far-right parties. Like the vast majority of the broader establishment, cultural, economic, political, right, still shares an understanding of what liberal democracy are and what the far-right threat is. And so to me, the situation in the US is far worse and far more dangerous than in France or even in Italy, where the far right might come to power, but not in the same way as they could come to power here.
Right. Anyone else want to chime in on those questions? We have another one from Alexandra. She talks about a bunch of interventions. Does the social justice perspective, is that something that we can integrate? This goes back to the idea of National Service Corps and so on.
I'm sorry, what's the question? I'm not sure I understood that.
So the question is that what can we do in terms of, informing our interventions by feminist and anti-racist justice theory? Some of these are chronically underfunded justice-based interventions, and so how can we, perhaps, if you want to, Mark, if you want to talk a little bit more about your idea of like some kind of a National Service Corps, is there a way in which, this could, again, there could be funding for it, universities could have a role to play, civil society more generally. I guess this is really about like how to make this work.
I don't have an answer for that. I'm with Cass. I despair of the situation in this country. I'm getting to the point I can barely watch the news. It's so unbearable. Look, this is not answering your question at all, but it kind of goes a little bit back to the minorities participating on January 6th and so on and so forth. I think the thing, again, to understand is that this is a movement that is spreading and is reactive to real and important things that are happening in our country. The Great Replacement conspiracy theory, of course, is talking about something real. So I want to bring up, because I think it's important, the couple of University of Chicago studies that did this very interesting work looking at people who've been arrested during the insurrection on January 6th and finding, if I remember, that there were, any given county in the United States was 3 times more likely to send an insurrectionist to Congress on January 6th if it had significantly lost white population in the preceding year, right? So in other words, there's something happening out there, right? We are changing demographically as well as in many other ways in the United States. And I think it's pretty easy to see it, at least in part, is the events of January 6th as a pretty direct reaction to that. Of course, aided and abetted and fueled by Trump and so on. On the question you really asked, it seems to me, this is a small thing, but in addition to a national service kind of idea and whatever we can do to help build up critical thinking and, the kind of thinking that allows people to say, really, there's the Democrats are running a secret ring of, pedophile nuts, murders and so on. It seems to me that that really, I know what I want to say. Another piece of that is really important, and that has happened to some extent, is, when somebody firebombs an Islamic mosque in Houston, when the local Jewish synagogue invites those people to come in and worship for the year when they're rebuilding in the synagogue. I just think that that is the kind of thing that helps to knit back our society, our dramatically fractured society in some small way. Again, as I said before, it's kind of a brick by brick, person by person thing, but unfortunately, I don't think there are any easy fixes, or even slightly easy, even moderately easy fixes.
There's a huge collective action problem. Jessica, you wanted to jump in about the CVE question.
I think maybe I can speak to Alexander's question a little bit about CVE. I did my PhD looking at gender mainstreaming strategies and primarily PCVE programming, and I sort of came to the conclusion that there's a fundamental flaw in how PCVE has been imagined, because it was imagined, it was defined as this pillar, right, of counterterrorism strategies that was intended to address the social drivers, the social ills that drive people's grievances, that drive people to become radicalized. And yet it is instituted within a state security framework, as in all CT is instituted within the state security framework, where programming is required to meet state security goals of diminishing the threat of terrorist attacks. So they tell you, go out and implement this program that's going to last 18 months, and you have this set budget of a certain amount of money, and address these social ills that are deeply ingrained within societies in order to ensure that there won't be further terrorist attacks. And that just, it doesn't mesh, right? There's a definition for what it's supposed to do, and it's not implemented within a framework that allows it to do that. And that's sort of where the gender mainstreaming question came in for me, specifically looking at that, was that, of course, we can't address gender inequality with an 18-month CVE program. So do you start to talk about CVE, PCVE programming needing to become more linked to wider development programming or social justice programming, or social workers who are dealing with a lot of these cases on a day-by-day basis of people that maybe are at a potential for becoming radicalized? And how do you do that without securitizing those jobs that are not being implemented in a state security framework, but then linking them into the PCV kind of pulls them into the security world? And so how can you do it where it's benefiting, where you're benefiting the type of programming by having a multi-agency approach and having these actors and different perspectives brought into it to inform it, to make it more successful? How do you, enrich PCVE or the intent of PCVE without securitizing it under a state security framework of CT policy? And I think that is sort of the fundamental problem or challenge of integrating it with these wider sets of works that Alexander was asking about, social justice, and that the other types of preventative working. Prevention is a long-running law enforcement area of learning, but it's about doing that without damaging or securitizing fields that are operating in the sort of public health model that Cynthia is talking about.
Right. I know Cynthia has to leave, and we'll hand her the mic, so to speak.
Yeah, I'll just leave. I have to leave for another meeting, but I will just drop a couple of additional thoughts in addition to whatever everyone's just been saying. I agree with a couple different things. One, in response to Alex DeBranco's question about the integration with social justice. Yes, what we found, I can't speak to what everyone else is doing, but we found that works really well in our partnerships. So like our foundational partnership with the Southern Poverty Law Center, where our integration of prevention work through the, victim and survivor centered is one of our key principles that keeps us really close to issues of social justice, and the way that we work to integrate the resources into communities, and the fact that not just domestically, but we're committed to translating the resources. We've released them in Portuguese and Spanish and German already. We've had requests now for Turkish and Norwegian. And so really trying to also create global access for free to that knowledge, making them completely free to all communities globally, and prioritizing the Global South by releasing them first in Portuguese. And I think, I know Michelle Prado is here, who was a real driver of that by asking for it and requesting those resources be available for Brazil. So, I think but my experience is that doesn't really work very well in the federal government. I mean, I don't have great hopes that the federal government sources of funding are going to be significant here. I think this is a place for civil society, private foundations, private donors to step up. I think the foundation, there's tremendous wealth in this country, and there are a lot of people who are worried about the state of democracy and should be. And I think, you know, when you look at the fact that the US landed on a list of global backsliding democracies at the end of last year, and when you look at the data on what happens when you get added to that list, how long it takes for countries to move off that list in one way or the other is about on average 9 years. So 9 years till a country either collapses or is restored, right? One way or the other off that list. It's not a quick fix. We're not talking about something that is, you know, how can we fix this before the 2022 midterms or even the 2024 elections? Like, we do need immediate interventions and help, but we also need somebody to be thinking about these middle and longer term issues of how do we get ourselves off the backsliding list, where it's not just about terrorism and extremism, but about voter suppression and about massive economic inequality and grievances that are really rooted in things where people on the left and the right have stopped believing in democracy itself. And so, you know, and we hear that a lot from the left as well. Like, why would I want to reinforce democracy? It's never done anything for me. And so I think that there's real nihilism going on in ways that also has to be addressed. And I'm not sure the federal government is really the place to look for answers there. I think we have to call on civil society, on NGOs, but also especially on wealthy individuals and donors and philanthropic community. And that is, you know, almost exclusively who's funded our work in peril are the foundation worlds, because they're able to pivot more quickly to respond to these things and in ways that are aligned with our values. So that's all I would say. And I hate to drop that and then go, but I've got to get into another meeting at 2:15, some calendar confusion here. So thank you, everyone. And sorry, bye.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. Cass, you had your hand up.
No, sorry, I was just an old man who got confused by the buttons.
All right. Okay, we have another question from Maxime. And it talks about the alt-right rebranding of various kinds of supremacist ideologies, and whether this is, you know, a problem of framing. Maybe, Cass, you could speak to that, because this is something that you know way more than any of us about.
I actually think that the alt-right term has already had its day, as well as the phenomenon. But what is much more important is that there have been previous topics, developments, and responses to developments that have led to a mainstreaming of the right and of the far right, and to a hybridization of nationalism and conservatism into what, for example, you have this movement called national conservatism, which is by and large the far right with a PhD, right? Is people who are at the middle of society, are well educated at the top schools, and who have influence, but who don't want to be stigmatized as the far right. Of course, 9/11 was one of the first, where Islamophobia created the bridge between particularly the mainstream right and the far right, but even people within liberal circles, within feminist circles, Jewish circles, like mainstream and far right came together. Refugee crisis of 2015 did the same, and now we have this kind of culture war, where you see the right and the far right coming together to the extent that it is completely impossible in many cases to separate the two, right? And so I think that is far more important than whatever the so-called alt-right, like Richard Spencer, did. Like, I think one of the most insightful things here in the US, for example, is not even so much Fox News, although it is often forgotten that Fox News was anti-Trump in the primaries and was kind of forced by its audience to jump on board. But what's even more interesting is something like the National Review Online, which is allegedly an intellectual conservative outlet, but which in 2016 was fiercely and never Trump. and now is just pushing the agenda, not just of Trump, but of Orban, and is barely distinguishable from Tucker Carlson, right? And I think that is something that is much more significant, and it's also just really puzzling, because at the same time there is a difference between Marine Le Pen and Boris Johnson, right? I mean, you would be crazy to say that if you both gave them full power, you would get exactly the same type of government. But in many struggles, in many issues, fundamental issues, they stand completely on the same side. And this makes it very hard, I think, to battle it, because we're often criticizing things that are said by the far right, which are supported by large groups within the mainstream. And they're not going to stand with you against the far right, because then they worry that you're also trying to criticize them. I'm not sure whether that helped in any way.
No, absolutely. Kessa, you were nodding. Do you want to have the last word here?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say that now that we see like there's a lot of lone actors more than pretty much ever, which is very frightening, which we saw in some of the strategy documents put out by the federal government. And that's something that we also need to focus on, that I think we don't focus on enough, because we're so honed on like the groups and everything, because there were a lot of lone actors that were at the insurrection, which we don't really even talk about. And then also you have the single movement actors that were also there as well. So when it comes to getting to those lone actors, it is very difficult, because they are hard to find on like researchers, and then also when it comes to even like law enforcement finding them, because they aren't a part of a group. So those are, I think, the group of people that we do need to focus on when it comes to PvE and everything, and especially because they're getting younger and younger, which Cynthia would touched on with our partnership with the SPLC, that it's good that social services and teachers and guardians, because they spend a lot of time with those children and students, that they're the ones that you equip with the tools to then help their students when they're in need.
Right. I'm going to hand over to Barbara. She's ready, and this is we'll close with her. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, thanks so much to the panelists for great insights on this very important topic. Thank you, Dai, for your great moderation and expert moderation. And thank you to all of those who shared their questions and thoughts and comments with us on the chat or on Twitter. I just wanted to sort of like point at two key ideas that we've learned from today. At least I've learned from today a lot, but I would highlight a couple. One of them is the general expert agreement that January 6th was a terrorist attack, or an attack intended to intimidate or coerce the population, meeting the criteria or definition of terrorism in the US. Even though, as Cynthia pointed out, this was a very different attack from what we've seen before, largely spontaneous and with broad partisanship among governmental and non-governmental actors. I would say, you might disagree, but that the panel concluded that the situation is concerning and rather, dark, and that sweeping changes in how we approach prevention are needed, and that those changes are needed or need to take place at a faster pace than what we've seen so far, and also from a multi-sectoral perspective. We haven't talked about this, and we didn't get to talk about this, but there are clear signs that the Capitol insurrection had effects beyond the US, to the point that at this very moment, a truck convoy of about 50,000 drivers is in and around Ottawa, the capital of Canada, demanding that vaccine mandates ends, not only among Canadian flags, but also Confederate flags and actually Nazi flags as well. Some of the most extremist demonstrators have already expressed the wish that the protests in Canada echo the events of January 6th in Washington, D.C. So the story continues. Thanks so much to all of those, again, that attended the meeting today, to our fantastic panelists and to our moderator, and thank you to those who chose to make a donation today to CARR. We are deeply thankful for your support. Stay tuned for more events organized by CARR during this year given, and see you soon.